I'll try to go into each phase separately, and after each phase we'll look at a satellite relocation and see how that applies so that we come back to space a little bit. So we'll try to get through that today. If we need to do a little bit of next session, we'll do that. But that way we have the theoretical part behind our backs, and then we can actually start on some space exercises, which should be more fun. So one more lesson of a bit more hardcore project management stuff, and then we can dig into space. So, initiation, which is the first part of the project, which is basically about getting a bird's eye view of what's going to happen, what am I getting myself into, what's it about. So that, all these questions, what, where, when, what is the project, what is the purpose of it, what's the background, what are my objectives, what are my requirements, and starting to think about what could the issues be, what could be the risks, who are my stakeholders, which is going to be important, who, not only who is the team, but who am I going to hand this project over to, and who are the people who are actually buying into it, who are either supporters, sponsors. So all these people are going to be your stakeholders. What team am I going to need to? It's really getting the first points in all the different aspects, but what's really important here is making sure you get all the different aspects. So you're not going to have all the details of each of the aspects, but you make sure that you're not forgetting any big part of the project. So if you're, we'll see when we're involving the satellite relocation, you're going to be moving a satellite in space. So first thing you're going to think of, I need to compute the maneuvers to stop the satellite. You have to make sure you don't forget about things like having a ground station to follow your satellite. So it's the time when you think about what are all the elements I'm going to need. So as I say, that's basically what the landscape is about. What am I going to need to have my project completed? And that's when you're starting to think also that what are my options going to be? So in the next phase, you're going to know which way you're going, and you're going to start looking at the details of that. But here, you can still think of, okay, I can do it this way or that way. What are the different ways I can handle this? And you're going to have to pick one. You can't keep all options open until the end. Sometimes you can keep two options if there's a decision coming up. But it's really going to be about, I'm getting to know my project. I have a big view of everything I need, and how am I going to get there? And sometimes, it's projects that are like relocating a satellite. It's something we do once or twice per year at SES, and we have ways of doing it, and it's working well, and there's no huge need to reinvent the wheel every time. So you have a way of proceeding. You can question things, but it's good to know what you need to question and what you shouldn't question. What are things that, when you're relocating a satellite 180 degrees, you can think, am I going to go one way or the other way? When you're doing 5 degrees, there's no point in wondering which way to go. You just go the shortest way. So sometimes it's important to ask the questions and to brainstorm about new ways of doing things, new tools. Sometimes it's important to stick to what's working and take advantage of the lessons learned from the past and know what went well and say, hey, this is working really well as it is. Let's keep it that way. And then as you go, new tools get developed, things start to change, and you think, this is the right time to change the way we're doing things. Or if you're in a domain where you have strong regulations, like in the space sector, strong is a big word, but there are some regulations. If you've heard that something's changed, this is the right time to find out, hey, this has changed. Is this going to impact the way I'm doing things? So this is kind of the questions you're going to be asking yourself at this point, and thinking about what's going to be my main, huge view of the project, and what's my direction to get to my final objectives. And as we're talking objectives, it's important to set, so this is typical, I say consultant vocabulary, set SMART objective. It's kind of memotechnic, where to remember, when you set yourself objectives, you need to be able to measure them. So the idea is they're called SMART objectives, so that they're specific, measurable, aligned, realistic, and time-bound. It's a bit too much, but basically what you're saying is don't set objectives that are vague. It doesn't make any sense, because in the end, when you're going to ask yourself, did I reach them? Saying, oh, depending on your interpretation, I'm not sure whether I actually reached them or not. So if you're developing software, you can say, okay, the software needs to do this, provide this output, and it shouldn't be crashing when I'm in it. It shouldn't crash, and it should be completed by this date. So you have something that's measurable. You say, okay, it was completed by this date. When I'm using it, I have a decent user interface, I can put in the data, and it's not crashing. Or if it does have a problem, I get a clear error message, and I know what to do. So it's about setting clear goals of where you're going and how you're going to measure that you actually reach them. So that's important. You're going to fine-tune this as you go. I mean, as we said, we are splitting the project into phases. This is all very theoretical. You'll see that when you're doing projects, the boundaries are never very clear. Sometimes you know you're really going a step forward, but sometimes you're kind of going back and forth and moving 3 steps forward, 1 step to the back, 3 steps forward. And sometimes you have to review something. It's like, okay, this is totally unrealistic. We'll adjust this a little bit. Or this wasn't exactly what I wanted. But you need, as you're going, you need to have a clear view and know where your uncertainties are. So the initiation phase, it looks very simple in terms of describing what it is. There's not so much to say. You're basically laying the foundations, getting the requirements, assumptions, seeing dependencies if you know that you're going to have such phase completed before you can start the next one. You need to identify that. Getting a big direction, knowing if you have cost involved, and the relationship, which is very often a trade-off between cost, quality, and time. You'll see that will come over and over again. If it costs, if it's going to be longer, or if you want it to be shorter, it's probably going to cost more to get more people involved, or you're going to have to reduce the quality to have everything done with the same budget in the same time. It's not always like that, but very often you'll see this triangle of cost, time, and quality comes back. And it's up to you to know which ones are the important ones for your project. Sometimes time is really, really, really a factor, and you're going to have to give up some things. When you're building a satellite, you have a launch slot, you have a launch date. When you're running your tests on your satellites that you're building, you have a switch that breaks on the satellite during the test. If you replace it, you lose your launch slot. So which one are you going to go for? Do you give up on quality? Is it, a redundant slot that's the backup of a backup and you can live without it? Or is it going to be a fundamental risk when you're in orbit? All of these things are things you will have to think of as you go. And it's going to happen over and over that you're going to be in front of decisions. And you go, okay, now what do I do? So you're going to have to kind of identify, what you can trade off, what you cannot.
Okay, so
yes?
are there certain quality criteria imposed by the government, for example, or different organizations?
By the government, not that I'm aware of, except that there are some regulations about that you shouldn't be polluting the geostationary orbit so that your satellite, it's not supposed to explode or things like that. For the launcher, there's definitely quality requirements so that it doesn't fall back on Earth. Or if it falls, that it doesn't fall in habitat regions. And there's probably quality requirements that are not quality, but regulations of what you can put on board of your rocket in case it falls back.
So there is a limit to how much quality you can trade for cost and time.
Yes, but in terms of actual quality of your satellite, I'm sure there are some quality restrictions, but I'm not sure there's some specifications like you need to be able to reorbit it and things like that. But whether you have redundancy on board and whether if it's broken when you get up there, I don't think government really cares. That's really more a business plan or a company. It's really company by company who is going to define that. And some companies, I know at SES we really make a point of every subsystem of the satellite has to have a redundant unit so that if it breaks in orbit, you have a backup. It's not the case for every satellite that's built, and it's certainly not the case for LEO satellites, where you have hundreds of them. They're done as a chain manufacturing thing, and they're building hundreds of them. There's no way they can stop and test each individual. It's more they're going to test, samples of satellites. So there you start having quality criteria that are more like, for cars where you test a certain sample and you're not going to individually test each. And so that's going to change a lot as well.
What about manned missions?
I think manned missions, in that case, quality, there's no question about that. Quality will, of course you always hear about budget. Budget is going to be limited, but you hear stories, I'm sure it's different in every country. The Americans will say that the Russians wanted to launch so fast that they would have launched even if they would have killed their astronauts. I don't think anyone believes that. I'm sure the Russians say the same thing the other way around, and they say the same thing about the Chinese, and everyone else, it's always everyone else. I'm sure everyone in the space industry has the same criteria. They may apply them with variations, of course, but everything you see about manned missions, quality comes first. Budget is limited. The impact is on time. You probably can get more budget by blocks and depending on who's in the government at the time and how many friends you have and whether you can pull it away from other projects. But yeah, no, for manned missions, I think that there's absolutely no question on that. There's no one, and we'll see that when we come to risk assessment, whether it's in terms of how much you value life or your reputation. Both of them are just so important that you're not going to take that risk. We see already how important quality is for non-manned missions, just for satellites that are just business satellites. So when there's lives involved, definitely there's absolutely no question about that. Okay, and the initiation phase is also about the human resource part of it, whether it is building your team and knowing what authority you're going to have and how you're going to be able to manage that. We're saying it's sometimes very easy because you're running a project within your team, you're the manager, project manager and manager of these people, but very often that's not the case, and you're running a project that's over several teams and you're not that person's direct manager. So it's about making sure you're going to have the authority to say, we need this to go faster. Can I get more time from my people? There's more time, more work, different things where you need your people to travel and things like that. So it's about setting this up and knowing how that's going to work. Sometimes it's straightforward, sometimes you really need to make things clear before you start, because it's not going to be so obvious. Whether it is because you're not sure that the people see you as a project manager, or is it whether it's because the managers of the team don't see this project as the most important that they have to handle. It's all going to depend on what's going on in the company at the time, basically. There can be conflicting projects, so there's going to be some discussion in the beginning to make sure that you have the right people, the right time, and the right authority to get things going. So these are all the little things that you're going to have during your initiation project. So now we'll look at how we apply that. So yes, go ahead.
How long is the initiation phase of such a project normally? Is it several weeks or more like months? It
really depends. And sometimes you're not. And the initiation phase is a phase that you need to sort of digest everything. Mm-hmm. It's not something that anyone is going to give you credit for. They're not going to say, oh, you have so much time to get used to the idea that you're going to have a project and get things going. Mm-hmm. So what my experience is it's a phase that exists. but it's more or less transparent. You're going to have to deal with this on the side and get it done as quickly as you can with whatever means you can, because there's nothing really produced out of an initiation phase, so it's not really recognized as a phase per se. What's actually going to come out of the initiation phase is a kickoff meeting, which is a good way to get everyone together. It's going to come not at the very beginning, because you need time to, as a project manager, to actually understand what's going on. It's kind of in the middle. Once you've understood where you're going, what team you have your team, and then to get the second part, the authority part, and the direction, get inputs from your team, how they see things, because it's important to get their buy-in and their opinions. But that's the only thing I can see that's really so-called a deliverable or a visible aspect of the initiation phase. So it'll depend on how urgent the project is. When we started, we did a satellite transition last year, and we started preparing for it more than a year in advance, which was maybe too early. And so the initiation phase was rather long, but it was almost invisible because it was so long in advance that no time was given to anyone to actually do the initiation phase. It was sort of, yeah, by the way, next year you're going to have a transition, so start thinking about it. So you start thinking about it without having really any time allocated to it. So it's really up to you to then decide, okay, when do I really need to kick things off and start getting into the actual planning? When is it too early? Where people aren't going to start having time for me because it's too much ahead of time. So that's really, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. It should be relatively short. In the transition project, it was actually too long, so that nothing was really done. And we could have delayed it because the actual time needed was about a month just to sort of identify people, and then there were restructurations in the company, so we had to rechange everything anyway. But it's really variable. It's really variable, and you'll see, depending on the complexity of the project, how much you know as well. If it's something you've been doing over and over, the team that actually takes care of the relocations, it's the same people every time. So for them, when we say there's a relocation that's going to happen again next month, I think their initiation phase is about an hour and a half, because what they need to do is take the previous document, clear the inputs from the previous relocation, just check who their contacts are going to be in the different teams, and they set up a kickoff meeting. So it's probably super quick for them.
Okay.
There are cases where, imagine someone new comes into that section, and they say, okay, you're taking care of the next relocation. We're talking 3 weeks now, because someone has to train him, he has to get in touch with the people, get to know them, he has to discover if he hasn't worked in the satellite business, find out what this is about. So it's really going to depend on the project manager and how new this is to you. So do you remember what we discussed last time about the satellite relocation? So do you want to take 5 minutes to think about what are the things you would have to think of? And maybe we can bring them up. Is there still paper here? Is this the one sheet? Is there a pen?
There is someone.
On the desk, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's it was here last night.
Okay, here.
I have a pen, but I don't think it's in
It's on the desk.
Oh, it's
On
up
the-
there on the other desk.
Next to Michelle. And then
Yeah.
Excellent, thanks. So, if you think about a satellite relocation, what are the things you think you'll have to be thinking about, or
What is the reason of relocation?
yeah, that's definitely.
Where you want to move it to.
Yep.
neighborhood around you.
Yes. Yes.
The cost.
Yeah. Directly or indirectly. So typically when you're inside a company and you're just working with existing teams, your cost is going to be mostly about, the resources and their availability. But it's also going to be about the fuel cost of the relocation. Depending on how fast you're going to move your satellite, you're going to use more fuel. So, and that's going to have an impact on your satellite lifetime. So, not directly in terms of paying for the relocation, unless you're outsourcing this, and it may be the case. I mean, if you don't have the competency, it's an activity you may need to outsource. But in this case, if it's an internal something internal, then it's in this case we're really going to be focusing on the cost in terms of fuel for the satellite.
How to relocate it?
Yeah. How?
You see the deadline too?
Yes.
In terms of teams, do you have an idea of who's going to be involved?
People who are available to work on it.
Who is
Yeah, but thinking about, what am I going to need? Which teams in my company?
it depends on the how we are going to relocate it. It depends on the method, and in comparison with the method, we can decide who is the professional to do this.
Yeah.
I think.
But actually, when you're relocating, you have all the satellite expert teams, the orbital mechanics team. So this is the space segment, actually. So you'll have this in terms of teams. You're going to have space. You're going to have the ground. That's very much involved because you're going to need a ground station to track your satellite. And then you're going to have one team that you would tend to forget, which is your regulatory or legal teams.
This is internal or external?
They're going to be internal teams, but they're going to be in contact with the administrations. So one of the things you're going to have to do is to find out where is my satellite registered. Yes, we have satellites registered in Luxembourg, in the Netherlands, in the United States. And depending on that, you have to address different regulatory instances. And the FCC in the United States, the ILR in Luxembourg, and basically just tell them we're going to move the satellite, do we have permission to broadcast from this orbital position?
Interesting question. When you want to launch a satellite, are you tied somehow to one of these regulatory institutions from a specific country, or you can more or less choose?
No, you're tied to one country.
Okay.
So that's when you're launching a satellite for SES, it's going to be either Luxembourg, the United States, or the Netherlands, based on where you have your home offices.
Okay.
So and the frequencies that you use in space are given to certain countries or certain. So you're getting the permission to operate your satellite from 95 east with this frequency. Or this frequency band. So you really have to go to a specific place and operate in a specific frequency. So these are the kind of things that are going to be involved. Yes?
In this, basically, are we not talking about the customers? Because I think there will be some customers on this satellite and we have to maybe migrate them to another satellite.
So that's going to be, remember the case we were looking at is a new satellite. So in this case, no, but yes, if you're moving a satellite that used to have customers on it and relocating it to somewhere else, then obviously that's going to be a very important part, is making sure that your satellite is offloaded. The transitioning is going to be probably a different project, getting them off, but it's going to be your first questions. Are the customers off of my satellite before I can actually move it? And it's going to be, your first question, reason to go. I guess I have a business at another orbital position and customers waiting, which is going to then link you to your deadline. And do I have to be there for a specific reason? So yeah, I think we've captured some. What is the project? It's bringing the satellite to the final orbital location. So in this case, we were actually launching a satellite. We had tested it. We're going to bring it to where it's going to start its business, so we know exactly where we're going. Question?
Yeah, I have a question in project at SES in general.
Yes.
Like, how do you decide on the timelines once you have all these constraints put down? Do you work your way backwards with a launch date already given to you, or do you start thinking about, okay, so this activity might need 2 weeks, this might need, based on your experience, that this might need 3 weeks to contact these teams, and then you have an overall timeline of say 6 months?
We have an overall, in this case when we're launching, we have an overall timeline, and we kind of know what the variations are going to be. Of course that always changes, but you have an idea of what your variations are. And typically in this case, the first risk when you're relocating a satellite, this is the final relocation just before you start your service. The first thing is your launch date can slip. But that you're going to know as you go. But once you have your launch date, you launch your satellite, you can still have it can be injected into the wrong orbit. That happened with SES-14, and then you may need an extra week to actually bring it to its final location, or if you lose the satellite, then it's a completely different story. Your project just dies. But often it's just it wasn't launched exactly into the orbit you wanted. You just need to change your plans, and you may need more time. When you're doing the orbit testing, you're actually testing each of the subsystems of the satellite. If everything goes well, because typically this is going to be test thruster 1, test thruster 2, test thruster 3, test thruster 4, do maneuvers, check the data, do the next steps. Check the heaters 1, check the heater 2, check the heater 3, and analyze the data. If everything goes well, it's going to be a very straightforward plan. If anything needs to be redone, that means you're adding days. So you're going to take that into account and have a few buffers. But of course, there's always pressure to reduce those buffers. So there may be some variations.
So if I understand correctly, you don't go backwards, you just, based on your experience with working with the teams, you put down the timelines with buffers.
You put down this, but yeah, when you're looking at this, you're actually going to go backwards until to the launch date and put all your things in sequence and see, okay, I'm probably going to be relocating. My baseline plan is relocate 15th of January, arrive 30th of January. And then as time goes, you're going to have inputs. My launch date was delayed by 2 weeks. Okay, so I'm going to have to relocate starting 30th of January. I can't start before that. But I still need to arrive before the 13th, so is it possible to speed up the relocation a bit? And then you start negotiations. As things delay, your buffers compress, and at some point you don't have any anymore. So did we miss anything? What do we need? Yep, we forgot actually the actual things we're going to need. We mentioned the teams. Okay, the maneuver plan is actually having the space teams involved to compute them. But the ground team is going to have to make sure we have ground stations available. When you're launching a satellite, you've probably looked at that well ahead of time because you already needed the Earth stations for the satellite mission. But if this is a relocation, say you have a satellite that's been in orbit for several years, you want to do a different mission. If you're moving far enough from the initial location, probably your ground station won't be valid for your new location. So then you're really going to have to make sure that you have a ground station available for the new location. So that's something you're going to have to look into. And the landing rights. So we were talking regulatory. The regulatory are going to have to inform, but also make sure we have the rights to do the business we want to do. And inform and get the go-ahead. The teams we discussed. Fleet planning is typically the team that is the liaison between your sales teams and your operational teams. So depending on the structure, this kind of team may not exist. Maybe it's just the sales talking directly to the operations in some smaller organization. Here we have a fleet team that's actually looking at the business plans with the different satellites, getting the inputs from the sales, telling the operational team, okay, we need to move this satellite here, and then telling the sales, okay, we're going to have this satellite for you here. So we'll interface with them. For the operations, they kind of represent the business, so the sales teams who are selling the capacity on the satellite. Your constraints is typically going to be arrival by a certain date. And the stakeholders are actually going to be all your teams involved, plus the sales teams who you're not going to have a direct interaction with them, but you are going to have to keep them informed if you have any major delay, because they're the ones going around to the customers selling the capacity and saying, hey, by 15th of January or 30th of January, we're going to have a satellite here, I'm going to sell capacity. If you're going to arrive 1 month later and they have contracts ready, they're not going to be happy. So you really need to keep them informed, whether it's via the fleet team or directly to them or via the management, it doesn't matter. It's going to depend on your organization. But you shouldn't forget about who your stakeholders are, even if they're not directly involved in the project. And then I didn't put them in here because they're almost always there. It's all the senior management. They're kind of your stakeholders as well, right? Because they're the ones who are telling you they want this done. And they are the ones who are going to intervene when you have any risks or when you have any major decisions to take. So I think this is about the same thing. We need to go to a certain position by a certain time. The maneuver sequence, ground stations to follow, we discussed. Yes, we were talking other satellites. So 2 things. There's the physical presence of satellites, so we're going to have to avoid them. If they're in between your initial position and final, you're going to have to fly above them or below them, just to not bump into them. So you can actually fly through the geo arc and coordinate. If you're actually moving faster, you're physically just, by the law of physics, you're just going to be above or below the geo arc because your drift rate is different. If you were drifting very slowly, you would go through the geo arc, you could coordinate. We just try to avoid that. There's no point in coordinating if it's not necessary. Just fly above. And typically, if you fly above 0.5 degrees per day, you're above the geostationary boxes, or below. So you're physically avoiding the satellites by doing that. But avoiding them physically isn't everything. You're also going to, because you aren't going to be transmitting any services during your relocation, but there is going to be some commanding and reading of telemetry from the satellite. So there is going to be communication with your satellite during the relocation phase. You're not just going to start and when it arrives, you try to capture your satellite. You're actually going to maintain command throughout all of your relocation. And you have to make sure you're not interfering with all the other satellites. So some of those satellites may be using the same frequencies as the one you're using. So there's a really important activity of coordination with other operators or yourself, if it's your own satellites, to make sure you're not going to interfere. So this is done by, first of all, you have some of the information that's available on the internet, but then you're going to send out notification letters to all the operators you've identified. Say, okay, we plan to move over your, usually you don't, for commercial confidentiality, you don't say where you're going. People usually guess because they know where you have slots, but what you're going to say is, with the relocation plan we have, we're going to fly above your box around this date. Our commanding and telemetry frequencies are this and this. Please let us know if you see any interference issues. And then I'll get back to you saying, watch out. We're using frequency that are very close. You always have a primary and a backup telemetry frequency and a primary and backup commanding frequency. So what you'll do is just switch to the other one if you're interfering with one of the two. And if you're interfering with both, you may want to switch off both just for the time you're passing by, but you're not going to do that for the full relocation, just for the time you're passing over the box. So you're not going to look at all these details now, but you're going to start identifying that at the initiation phase. Just thinking, okay, I need to remember to do this. And then yes, as we're saying, the constraints about when can you start and when do you need to get there. You can't start before you've completed your previous activity. It's going to be dependency. There's nothing you can do. You can decide to not, if it's taking longer, you can decide to skip a test. But usually you're going to accept your satellite from the manufacturer after the in-orbit testing. So you're not going to want to accept your satellite before you've tested all of the equipment on board. So this is rarely, at start of life, it's not going to be easy to delay that. You can try to speed it up. If you've planned your in-orbit testing to be during day shifts, you can say, okay, we would need to have this done during 2 shifts per day or 3 shifts per day and have this done around the clock to get this done faster. But skipping tests is not usually advised. It's very rarely done. And yeah, the ground stations we've identified. The direction, I've said, yes, go ahead.
While testing, if everything is okay, it's okay. But what if something is wrong with the satellite, like the thrust is not working? What will happen then?
Then there's the discussion whether you accept or don't accept the satellite.
Mm-hmm.
If it's something minor, you're just going to either accept it and try to get some refund, say you're not paying for something, have an insurance claim on it, put that together. Because you have to agree, the manufacturer has to agree that it's actually not working before you can actually make an insurance claim for it. Yeah, if it's not working at all, you say, I don't want to take the satellite, and then there's a whole discussion ongoing. But I haven't seen any big disagreements. I think there's some minor insurance claims, saying, okay, we have one thruster less, we're starting our life with one thruster less, or we don't have the redundant heater, or this or that. What you may see is that your mapping, that's one of the big activities of the in-orbit testing, is mapping and checking your footprint. So you go to the different places at the edge of your footprint, and something may be slightly different. And you really want to identify that, because that's going to impact all your discussion with customers. By the way, we were expecting this power in this, but we actually have a little less. If you have more, you're not going to say anything. It's just going to be good for everyone. But just adjusting for one satellite, that was a long time ago, the mapping was completely off. And they couldn't figure out, and they ended up, of course you don't have any pictures in space, but it seemed like there was part of one of the thermal blankets that was still over one of the reflectors. So they tried to move the satellite around a bit to move things out of the way. And so this definitely delayed the process of the in-orbit testing. So these are the kind of things that can happen. You try to figure out whether it's really a problem, whether it's a complete failure, or just something that went wrong. And yeah, then discuss with the manufacturer and the insurance how you handle it.
And if there is a severe dysfunctionality, is it then that you need to relaunch another satellite? And
It may have, yeah, it could. I don't think I've ever seen anything where you notice during the in-orbit testing that the satellite is not at all usable. But yeah, it could happen that you realize once you launch that your payload doesn't work at all. Then yeah, you would have to reorder a satellite and think of a plan B. But I don't think that's ever happened. I've seen some minor things that didn't work, thrusters that didn't have the expected performance. It's more underperformances or but I've never seen complete failures when you're actually, and not at the beginning of life. They can happen with time, but I haven't seen anything huge, which doesn't mean it can't happen, right? It doesn't. But yeah, if you have a complete failure, then yeah, definitely. If none of your payload is working, there's nothing you can do. If your power isn't up and you can only use like a third of the payload that you wanted, say your solar panels don't deploy completely. You're supposed to deploy to be able to charge your batteries, to get your payload to go, and say they only half deploy and you can only use half of your payload. You can start your business, but definitely you're not going to have the full capacity you expected, and that's going to put in a trigger on the insurance claiming. But yeah, at least you have something to start with until you decide whether you buy another satellite or if you go for something else.
And these assurances are especially meant for this business?
Yes.
Or? Okay.
Yes.
So you don't go to AXA and...
Well, it's the same names, but yeah, they have specific space segments. And the insurance, there's separate insurances for the launches and for the satellite, the in orbit. And it's a huge process because it involves huge amounts of money. But yeah, they actually have a briefing for all the insurers once a year, where they, for 3 days, they explain the satellite health of all the satellites and go through all the details of all the events that took place. Because over the year you have little things that happen, you know, the solar radiations, you have some equipment that fails, some thrusters that fail, and then the insurers are incredibly competent and they know a lot about the business. And of course they have the view of all the operators. So sometimes you think it's a single event, and then from the questions they ask, you realize, looks like some other operator had the same thing, and then you try to find out from the manufacturer, it's like, it looks like this is something that happened in series. It's not just us, so can we find out more? You plan on putting the same equipment on next satellite? How about trying to retest this? So yeah, the process with the insurers is a huge business as well.
Okay. So they're really competent also about the space part?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
It's very often people who have worked in the space industry, at least some of them, who have worked with the manufacturer. So many of them are very, very well up to date on what's going on. And yeah, I think the responsibility, we've discussed, what teams do we have. As I was saying, with your teams, one of the things we have is, are our teams available, are the people available? But you may also need to check whether your operations center has not only the manpower, but the equipment to follow your relocation. Relocations are special operations that need your satellite to be followed from the console during more or less the whole relocation. You want special attention because it's special operations. I hear you're going to visit SCS at some point, so you'll see the control center, and you'll see that they have 50 satellites. I think they're controlling about 30 from Betzdorf. They don't have 30 consoles, so they share the consoles with several satellites, and they switch over from one to the other when there's something happening on the satellite. But you're going to have one console blocked for this satellite, so you have to check whether there's no conflict with other operations that actually allows you to do this. So that's something else you may need to check. The ground stations we discussed, and the regulatory we've discussed as well. So these are all the kind of things you're going to have to think of and put together. You're not going into the detail yet, but it's really flagging all the little things. Think, okay, this is about putting the post-it notes on your attack. Don't forget this, don't forget this, don't forget this. Initiation is really about going to your first kickoff meeting with all your post-it notes. During your kickoff meeting, checking that you have someone to handle each of your post-it notes, and asking, is there anything that I've forgotten, and seeing if anyone in the room saying, well, by the way, we're going to have to think about this we have never done before. Say you need a special maneuver, the flight dynamics tells you, okay, to relocate, we're going to have to do a maneuver with a type that we've never done before. We want to test this before, so okay, you have time to test it before, when are we going to do this? do you need to develop special procedures? Do you need more time? So this is where you need to identify these little things and talk to people and say, okay, I want to make sure I'm not forgetting anything when I move into my next phase and do the planning. And as I said, we're going to have to establish success criteria so that at the end of your relocation, you're going to be, okay, did I do my job correctly? Have we reached what we wanted to do? So when you're launching a new satellite, typically your goal is to bring your satellite to your final orbital location and get it ready for service by a certain date. So one of your success criteria is to make sure you've arrived at the right place at the right time, and that your initial satellite configuration is configured so that you can launch your services on the day. So when I say the configuration, what I mean is some of the satellites just have, so if you have a satellite over Europe, your uplink can be anywhere in Europe, your downlink can be anywhere in Europe. Some of the satellites have configurations that are more complex, where you can either, you have more footprints and you can uplink from Europe, downlink somewhere over Russia, uplink from Europe, downlink over Africa, or uplink in Africa, downlink in Africa, uplink in Africa, downlink in Europe. You have lots of different options, and sometimes you can't activate all of the options. You're going to have to select. Some of my transponders are going to be Europe, some of them are going to be Africa, some are going to be Europe, Africa, Europe. And when you're testing, you're of course testing the different configurations. But when you're starting your service, you have to be in the right configuration to start, what you've agreed on with your customers. So you're going to have to, what we call them configuration memos. Each company probably has their own way of labeling things, but you're going to have to make sure that, when you start the service, you have the right configuration memo that's activated. So this is something you have to think of, because when you're in the relocation, you're really thinking moving the satellite. You sometimes lose the perspective of the service that's behind it, but it's a really important aspect. Make sure you're bringing the service there, so it's important to make sure you have your configuration ready. And sometimes you're already going to bring this information back up, so that when they do their testing, they can actually do their testing so that they finish their tests in the configuration that you want to be in at the end, to avoid having unnecessary operations, especially when you start getting time critical. Another success criteria is minimum fuel consumed. So whether that's going to be you're allowed to only impact the lifetime by so much, or just saying, okay, we just want as little as possible, it's really going to depend on, some of our satellites have 30 years of lifetime, so it's not as important. Some where your design life is 15 years and you realize that after the launch you're really close to these 15 years, consuming as little as possible for your relocation is going to be very important. So depending on the time, it's going to be more or less critical, but it's always going to be there. No one wants, once you're up there, you can't refuel, or not yet. It's going to be tested, but it hasn't been done yet. So once you're there, you have the fuel that's on board, and that's it. So you don't want to be wasting it. As I was saying, what determines how much fuel you're going to use is how fast you relocate. So it doesn't depend. You're actually going to do one maneuver to start, and then you're going to move, and one maneuver, just one or several, but you're going to start, you maneuver to start, you relocate, and then you stop. And it's how fast you go that's going to determine how much you consume. And then there's one that may seem straightforward, but you want to keep your satellite healthy, which means you don't want to take any risk on any of the parts of your satellite. If they say you have to go faster, but your thrusters haven't been validated for longer maneuvers, you may not want to do that. So you're going to have to keep in mind that you don't want to break your thrusters to relocate faster, even if you've been told that it's okay to consume more fuel. If you're doing a very long relocation that's over several months, you're going to go through periods where your satellite is in the shade of the Earth. They're called eclipse periods. And your battery management is very different. So you really have to, you're switching on, switching off the batteries manage this period when you're in the shade of the Earth, and you have to heat up the satellite to keep it warm, because otherwise the components get extremely cold and they're not validated to work under such cold conditions. So yes.
All these operations, are they pre-programmed before launch, or are the operations team actually doing any live activity when the, for example, the eclipse management and all?
Yes.
So are we doing it live, or is it pre-programmed into the satellite itself?
They're done live. They're launched knowing you're going to have to do them, so everything is prepared to be able to do them, but it's really something that's, because it's going to depend on where your eclipse, your times are going to depend on exactly where your satellite is located.
No,
So
but
you can't
that can be predicted, right, by the mission analysis process.
Absolutely, but if a satellite is going to go for a single mission at one orbital position, I guess you could technically program it, but more and more that they become versatile, and they're just moved around, or they can be, they keep the flexibility to potentially move it around. But from what I've seen, it remains very manual. There may be some automatic things. I mean, maybe that some heaters are switched on automatically when the temperature drops. But from everything I see, they're still, if not entirely commanded, at least monitored very manually. And there's a huge activity going on during eclipse periods. It's known to be one of the periods where the satellites are in, I'm not going to say weaker, but you're putting more attention, because there's a lot of strain put on the satellite during those periods. Yes?
If I understand correctly, the fuel consumption is only defined by the velocity of
Yes.
the satellite and not the distance.
Yes, absolutely. There's no drag.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's counterintuitive for us on Earth, but yeah, it's just the velocity.
Okay.
So what do you mean by that exactly?
Sorry?
What do you mean by that exactly? For different distances, if the same velocities use the same fuel we consume?
What I'm saying is that whether you're going to relocate 5 degrees or 108 degrees it's not what that's going to determine how much fuel you use. It's the speed at which you go there.
Because you just have to give one initial push.
You just give
Yeah.
the initial impulse. Yeah. Okay, so that's the initiation phase. So once you've had that, you have your bird's eye view of what's going to happen next. Now you have all the information, you're going to have to start planning. It's like, okay, I know everything I need to do, and we look now at how are we actually going to start planning things and putting the pieces together. So we'll do the theoretical part, and then we'll actually do the exercise for the relocation. But if you have questions regarding the relocation, we can mix the two and interact as we go. That's fine. So what's going to happen during the planning phase? So this is where you actually go into the details of your project. Going to look at what needs to be done, exactly each activity that needs to be done, just not the overall, I'm moving a satellite. It's like, what's each individual activity that's going to happen? What do I have to deliver? Of course, you have to deliver your satellite in the orbital position, but are there any documents that need to be delivered? Whether it's the regulatory documents or anything internal, including the document that needs to go to communications, or at least the mail saying, watch out, communications, you need to inform, whether it's in our books or typically your CRM, SAP, whatever tool you're using to manage your sales contracts, they need to update that as well. So that's going to be taken into account as well. Your resources in more detail, you've probably done that before. If there's anything that you haven't identified, this is where you need to make sure you have everyone you need. Your dates. Again, you have your preliminary dates in the initiation phase. Here you're going to start looking at, in your breakdown of your project, do I have intermediate dates? Do I have milestones that I need to have these things completed by? In a relocation, there are not really any intermediate milestones, but it's something that happens typically. I mean, in larger projects, you're going to have intermediate milestones. And they're actually helpful to know that, you know, I have a first step, and these are all the things I need to have done by my first step. And the cost as well, but that's typically managed here. Your budget is going to be done at the planning phase. So you've selected a direction in your initiation phase. Now that you have your direction, you're going to really set the roadmap and set, we said we're going to identify the actions, and you're going to set the sequence. You're going to say, okay, I'm going to, you know, have satellite engineering, look at the satellite health, see if I can actually relocate during that period. When I'm okay, I'm going to get my orbital mechanics team to compute my maneuvers, check that that's okay, have my duration. Do I have intermediate due dates? Do I have any dependencies? Do I need to have something completed? My IoT needs to be finished before I can even start. Things like that. Do I need, you know, if another satellite, you're learning that you need, if you bring a new satellite in to allow you to move, so a satellite needs to arrive before this one can move, and all these things like that. You can have dependencies within your own project as well. Typically when you're building a satellite, the mating of the bus and the payload, usually they're built in 2 blocks, and at one point you're going to mate the 2 to make your block. You need each one of these to be completed before you can do the mating. I mean, it seems straightforward, but in your planning sequence, you have to take that into account. There are steps that you cannot do before you've completed others. Look at the cost. Again, each individual. In the cases we'll be looking at, there won't be so much cost directly. You are not going to look into budget so much, but I think you look into that with Philippe for all the ESA projects where cost is very, very important. Who does what? You have your team, you have your activities. Making the link between the 2 is always important to make sure you don't have an activity without someone who's doing it. And if you have someone who's not doing anything, that's usually nice because you can always find stuff for people to do. But the other way important around it is kind of a problem. And you end up with your plan. So that's your main outcome of your planning phase is obviously to have a plan and you have your sequence of what's going to be happening when and by who. That's the main, it's very often the biggest part of your project management. Yes?
Like once your planning phase is done, like SES release a kind of a project document or a planning document? Or how is it being communicated to everybody, the entire system?
It's really on a case-by-case basis. In big project like satellite procurement, there are different phases. Like typically you have a preliminary design review, critical design review, and once you've done each of these, you have a big document that's sent out to all the team members. And that's typically going to happen. For a small project like a relocation, nothing specific. I mean, it's going to be an email to the guy saying, okay, we're ready to go. So it really depends on the size of the project. Philippe will tell you, and for the ESA projects, the documentation and the rigidity is much larger, and you have very specific documentation giving out in different steps of your project. As I said here, it's intermediate project, and again, the planning and the execution, you're going to go into your execution phase, but the boundary is going to be not as clear. I know in project management courses, they're going to tell you, you need to have finished your initiation phase before you can actually step into your planning phase. You need to finish your planning phase to actually step into your execution phase. My experience is that you're stepping into your execution phase, you're going to have variations on your plan and you're going to adjust. It's maybe not called planning phase anymore, but you're going to do the equivalent of the planning activities, but for the rest of the project, for the second half of the project, or as you go. So the border isn't as sharp as it's in theoretical courses. But of course, you need to at some point have, you know, a clear view before you can actually move to the execution phase. But it doesn't mean you're never going to come back. But you do need to have, so you know, your blocks need to be completed one first time. And then something you're going to, it's not something you're going to do during the planning, but it's something you need to think about how you're going to do during the execution, is how you're going to monitor the progress of your project. So you have set expectations for the end. You need to have expectations as you go. You need to decide what information are you going to get as you go from people. You can't, I mean, sometimes it's short enough that you can ask people to say, okay, just tell me when you're done. But then if you do that, you're at the risk of, you know, if the guy doesn't reply, and then you ask, okay, is it done? He says, oh no, I haven't started. You're going to be in trouble. You have to wait for the person to do the entire task. So what information are you going to request? Are you just going to, you know, touch base with him once in a while, saying, hey, is this moving according to what you're expecting? Depending on how well you understand the task, how long it is. I mean, if it's something that takes one day, you don't necessarily need to have all the detail. But if it's a long task, you're going to want to have some information about how it's proceeding and how well it's progressing. So that you can start thinking about what am I going to ask from each one to make sure that my project is advancing like I want it to do, like I want it to. How often? Again, depending on the burden, the length of the task. How often are you going to get your team together, get parts of the team together, reach out to everyone? Probably depending on the phase of your execution, you're going to, you know, in the beginning you can start by seeing every 2 weeks, and as you get closer to the actual start or during the execution, you may want to have a daily catch up with people saying, okay, any issues today? Are we on track? Okay. And it may be a 10-minute meeting in the morning. And did we have any issues yesterday? Do we need to tackle anything specific today? Are we all ready to go? And just have this quick catch up every morning to get everyone going and to make sure everyone is on the same page. And you're not discovering after a week that, yeah, on Monday we had this problem, we weren't able to do the stuff that was supposed to be done on Tuesday, and then you've lost an entire week. So it's really depending on your activities. You're going to want to adjust as you go. For relocation, you may identify periods that are, typically you're going to have the maneuvers in the beginning, the maneuvers at the end, but there may be some stuff in the middle where you have a specific hinder that's in the way. A hinder is a satellite that interferes. So you may want to check with your team, okay, did that go well, or are you ready for it tomorrow? So it's up to you to identify these important places where you're going to want to check, or you're going to have a change. When you're relocating for a very long distance, you're going to have a switch over from one ground station to another, with probably an overlap with the two. Before you do the switch over, you're going to want to at least meet with your ground team and probably with everyone saying, okay, in 2 days we're switching over. Is the second ground station ready? Have we checked everything? Are we ready for the handover? And even though there's not more than that, but make sure that everyone's on the same page. So it's going to be a loop, but here you're really going to identify how you think you're going to do it. And sometimes you think you're going to do it and it's going to work that way. Sometimes you have to adjust as you go because it's like, okay, this isn't working, the people aren't replying to me, or I had planned a meeting in the morning, but actually I need some people from the United States. They're still sleeping at that time, so I need to change the time of our meeting. Sometimes it's as simple as that. But at least you have to think about it, and then it's easier to adjust if you've thought about it. You think, okay, I'm going to do it this way. At least you've given it some thought, and even if it's the wrong answer, once you've thought about it, it's easier to change. So scoping, besides agreeing on all the activities we need to do, scheduling, it's setting the time frame, so making your plan with the actual timeline and the cost of each of your planned activities. So we're going to look at each one of these in more detail. The scope, we looked at everything that goes in the scope. How that's usually done is by decomposing your work into workable elements, which we call the work breakdown structure. You'll see that often in project management courses. Most people just say WBS. So it's basically just taking your project and splitting up all the Lego pieces. Say, okay, I'm going to need A, computer maneuver, B, computer stop maneuver, C. Now get a ground station, and find all the little Lego pieces that you're going to need to do. And just, at this point, you're not doing a planning or scheduling. You just write them all down, all the little activities, and breaking down so that you can actually look into each one of them and think, okay, this is what I need to do. And it makes it, yes, go ahead.
So what does WBS stand for?
Work breakdown structure.
Work breakdown structure.
Yes. So it's really just, getting all the individual parts of your work, and we'll look at how that breaks up for relocation. And for each of these elements, you're going to have to look at who's going to do it and how much is it going to cost. The scope also includes, and that's something, depending on people, they put it in the work breakdown structure or not. It's debatable, I think. There's no wrong answer. Some people put it separately. Is everything that's going, all the documentation that's going to go into your project, what documents do you need, what procedures do you need, and again, what resources and budget do you need for this? Yes?
For this particular case, can you please elaborate on what are the costs that we are trying to understand, trying to capture here?
In the work breakdown structure?
No, in the cost. I mean, what are the elements that we are considering? Because if it is just because I see a sizable part of the cost is operational cost, but then the operational costs are already they are like permanent employees. So is that included?
Exactly.
In the cost?
So in a relocation where you're working with your teams inside your company, you're not outsourcing anything. Your cost, as I said, is going to be basically just the fuel that you're going to use for the relocation. For what may happen is if you're relocating for a longer distance, you may need to rent a ground station. So then the cost of the ground station is going to come into account. Or if you need, so there was one case where we had a satellite that had a thruster failure. We weren't sure we were going to be able to use it for relocation because you need to do longer maneuvers to get it going. If you need to have specific analysis done by the manufacturer saying, okay, could we use the thruster in this mode? And the manufacturer says, well, to do that analysis, that would cost that so much. Then you would want to see, okay, do I want to find another way of doing it by doing many small maneuvers, or do I want to invest in getting validation from the manufacturer to use the thruster in a different mode? These are the things that could come into account. But for internal projects like this, I'd say your cost is you're not going to be dealing with any specific budget. Maybe if you need a specific training for something, or you need specific equipment, but you're not going to be dealing with huge costs like when you're building something or ordering a new software or something like that. Okay, the schedule. I think the schedule is relatively easy to understand what it's about. Once you've done your breakdown structure, you have all of your individual activities. So you define them. You're going to have to assign a duration to each one of these tasks, and you're going to sort of put them in sequence. So you can basically just put them one behind the other, but working like that, anything would need gears, right? So you're going to have to check what can be done in parallel. Sometimes it's different teams, so it's very easy. You can at the same time start computing the maneuver plans and have someone check that the satellite health is fine and have someone check that the ground stations are available. This can all be done in parallel, but you'll need to check whether you have any dependencies, any relationships. Does this need to be completed before you start something else or not? Same thing with resources. In your breakdown structure, you've probably started looking at this in the initiation plan, but look at that each one of your blocks has a person associated to it, that someone's taking care of it. The duration, so I think here it's the sequence. Actually, we could have put the duration together with sequences because they often go together. But you have your sequence. To each one, you associate the people who are going to work on it and how long they're going to last. And with that, you actually have your schedule. So you have the list of your activities, which order they're going to come in, and which can be done after or before the other. Adding buffers is always important. Depending on the length of your project, you might have more or less buffers. Yes?
Is there some kind of ratio between the length of the project and the buffer, like 10%, something like that? Or is it also case by case?
It's a case, but it's about identifying where your risks are. Some things are very, that they're not going to move. But yeah, it's a case by case. It's hard to say. I think some things are very straightforward. From what I've seen in the relocations, there's a large uncertainty on the start date, but your plan, there's usually very little change in your plan. So once you've actually managed to agree on a start, there's very little that's going to happen in between. Because once you've started, there's management of your satellite urine. You may need to get in more people because you've seen some telemetry values that are not expected, but it doesn't usually affect the duration of your project in the end. So in this case, you need a buffer for the start, which is going to affect the end, but I haven't seen much variation in the two. For other things, you can, for the transition between customers from one satellite to another, the variations are huge. You have so many things that come that are unexpected. The last transition we did, the easiest customers to transition were going to be the Middle East customers because we had identical transponders on the two satellites. So we thought we were just going to be able to, switch on the transponders on the new satellite, switch off the old one, and transition them, and it would be done. And it took forever. It just took forever. There was some preliminary work that was needed that couldn't be done because the teams had changed, and then when they were going to do it, they had maintenance on their network, so they didn't want to do it, and then there was the rainy season, and it was incredible. It was really the one that was technically the easiest ended up being came onto our critical path. So it's really difficult. Sometimes it's very difficult to evaluate. For relocations, frankly, except for the start date, I haven't seen many variations. I've seen some variations, some stress build up during the planning phase because you're trying to get. You suddenly have an Earth station that it's in maintenance that you were going to use. Do you have backup ones? Are you going to rent one? Is it going to be ready? But in the end, it just affects the start date again. But once you're ready to go, you're ready to go. So yeah, it's hard to answer. And if you're new to the subject, it's probably going to be difficult to evaluate. Yes.
I have a more general project management question in
Yeah.
SES. So usually when we have repetitive activities like that, people start understanding the buffers. Like
Yes.
you give the deadline, but they know that this has a buffer.
Yes.
So how do you manage that? Because they would like to consume that buffer and make life easy for themselves.
You try to hide them. Either by openly lying to people. I mean, in a way saying, you know, I need this by then. Saying, because otherwise it's going to affect my stop date. And not, what I'm saying, not saying you have a 2-day buffer in there. Not saying, you know, you're not going to say I need to have it there because I'm starting the next day, but you're saying, if you don't have it then, I won't be able to start then. Not saying you have a 2-day buffer. But, yeah, as soon as you tell people, I want it there because I'm taking into account that it may be delayed, they're going to do it. And you end up knowing what buffers people take. So you know, he always adds an extra week. And it's hard to think, okay, I'm still going to do it on time because I know he has an extra week. It's the advantage and disadvantage of working with the same people all the time. You know how they function, but you still need to have them. The people who put their buffer usually do it for a good reason. Is they know, well, some just like the comfort of it, but they know what uncertainties may come up and they know that they actually will. I know that the payload teams that do the in-orbit testing, they usually try to have a 1 week buffer because they know that the plan is done, it's success oriented, and in-orbit testing is about checking that everything works, and you probably will have something that's not going to work. So you have a buffer, but you actually need it to be able to analyze anything that's unexpected. So then you try to communicate, it's like, okay, we're blocking 4 weeks, we have 4 weeks, but we need this because, so you try to explain, you know, when people start knowing about it, you try to explain, it's like, okay, on the last day, my last activity is planned then, but, you know, as we go forward, I can reduce my buffer. After my first weekend, I can move it down to 4 days. After my second weekend, I can reduce it to 2 days. But at the start of my in-orbit testing, I want to have a full week buffer because I don't know what may come up. So you can try to communicate about it. How understanding people will be varies. Some people are going to dig into it right away. And once you work with operational teams, you know why they want it. But yeah, when you're talking to salespeople, they want to sell yesterday, right? So it's sometimes difficult. And then you have to be really strict, saying, okay, we won't accept any contract signatures before this date because we just can't guarantee it. And you know, if the satellite is there earlier, we're happy to provide. You know, if on day -5 the satellite is there and customers are ready to move earlier, that's super. But I don't want to take the risk of having them plan for this earlier if my satellite's not going to be there. So it's about communication. But yeah, most of the time I see people just try to hide it. Then you end up discovering it, but it's mostly just kind of hidden in between the lines. If you actually bring in your schedule, I think for satellite construction you actually see the buffers in there, but I think you see the big buffers. So you'll see all of your you actually have all of your satellite construction blocks of the different components, when they're assembled, when the 2 major blocks are mated, the big vibration tests and all of these things. And then you'll probably see a buffer of like 2 to 3 weeks before it's taken to the launch site. Because anyway, that's when the plane leaves. And then there's a kind of an official 3 weeks buffer, but you see that's going to be nibbled into as you move. But that's because at some point you need to reserve a plane for the transportation of the satellite. You can't take the risk of reserving that plane for, you know, just at the end of your critical path. So then you're going to see it, and you know it's going to be taken slowly. And if it's not, well, then you'll just see, you know, when you get there, is your plane a little bit earlier, or do you just wait for your 1 week, or 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, or what's left? But that's I think it's the only time I've actually seen the buffers in there. And I'm sure inside each one of the small blocks, people have their own little buffers. But yeah, I don't. In small project for relocations, I haven't really seen any. You don't actually. Well, you can show them. You could actually say, okay, if you show them, I think you have to put in why they're in there. So I'm putting in 2 days, and you can't say just because I'm expecting delay, but just say, okay, just because there may be such and such thing coming up. So we're waiting to see if we have the result of this test, and we may need some extra work there, so I'm keeping 2 days here. If you explain that, I think then it's actually acceptable to have your open buffers in there. And then maybe for very long projects, then it would actually make sense to actually show, okay, we have this huge 6-month project, followed by, with a milestone, and then the second half between the two. Yeah, then I think it makes sense, just to cover up for employees being sick on holiday and any other mishaps that could happen. Okay, just some more words on the schedule. So you have your list of activities, the time they need, the order. These are some of the, yes. Oh, sorry, I thought you were. Some of the dependencies that you'll see in project management courses. I think the typical one you'll see is you need one part of a project to be finished before you can start the next one. So that's called finish to start. You can have a whole bunch, and you can have the start to start is you can only start one before the second starts. Or you can only finish one before when another has started. You can try to think of all these combinations, how they come up. The one I see is the finish to start, or you have the intermediate one. You need an intermediate milestone to be done before you can actually complete. Typically, if you're waiting for an analysis on a thruster that's going to say what your maximum firing time is, and then this is going to continue with other tests on the thruster, but you're going to need to have this max duration before you can actually compute the maneuvers to know what duration of maneuvers you're going to be able to do. So these are the kind of dependencies you can have. You can only, when you're testing a satellite, if you're actually moving the big tests on the satellite where you're vibrating them and doing the different tests in the vacuum tests and things like that, of course you're moving the satellite into one room, from one room to another room. You can only do one when the previous one is done because you actually need your satellite to physically be there. So, but that's typically a start to finish, or finish to start. So these are the typical ones, but you'll see the nomenclature varies and there are different ways. But doing this is going to be important because it's going to allow you to look at what they call the critical path, so which is the shortest path for your project to be completed. This is just an illustration. So have you ever seen a Gantt chart? It's the typical scheduling. I think you can actually make them in Excel now. If you have project management office on your laptop, you can actually make complex Gantt charts. But it allows you basically to visualize the different tasks that you've broken down your project into, see when they're going to happen, once they're completed, and how they kind of link. So this project here can only start when this one is finished. These two can only finish when both those. Maybe it's because they need to be put together at some point, so they can only finish together. So they're only at this point. So you can have these dependencies, and you can also show this on a nice chart. Or for a big project, it's very useful to have this. For a small project, you can have it all in your head. For larger projects, it's very nice to have these charts to actually show everything that's going on, and it's a very effective method of communication. I find that when you're communicating about projects, there are two things that work: is showing a schedule and showing action items so that everyone knows what's expected of them. Those are the two Especially when you're working with engineers, that works really well to have just a list of things that you need to do. It's a nice summary. It doesn't explain all the background. It doesn't explain all the details, but it's a quick look into it. You see the schedule, you see where you are, and you see what's got to do, and you can go down the action item list and see what's expected of you. It's minimalist. It's very it doesn't compensate for any. It's not an exchange for any real life communication or detailed communication. But if you need to get something through very quickly or very effectively, that will work. I was talking about critical path. It's basically, this is a satellite construction. And so we're looking at the different testing. So this in part of the schedule, you're integrating the satellite, so which is basically the mating of the payload and the bus system. So you're putting all the pieces of the satellite together, attaching the solar panels, and you're actually building down your block, which is going to go into the launcher. And then your satellite is going to go through a bunch of tests. So the first one is the functional test. I'm not sure what this one is, but then you have the thermal vacuum and vibration tests. And all of these are going to happen one after the other before you actually have your final preparation to be put into the plane. So if you actually take the line from the shortest path to get to the completion, that's what's going to be called the critical path. So taking down all of your dependencies. So here there's no overlay. Sometimes you'll have an overlay, but with the critical path basically means that any activities that's on this path that's going to be delayed is going to affect your final project date. So if any of these tests takes longer than expected, the satellite readiness is going to be delayed. Anything that's on your critical path is going to be delayed. So if here you have an activity, say you're doing the integration without the solar panels, your solar panels are, need to be attached here, and you're building them here, you have a 2-week buffer. This is not the critical path yet. If suddenly your solar panel construction gets delayed and gets pushed beyond this, you're suddenly affecting your critical path. So it's a quick way of seeing whether your final production date is going to be affected. So it's a word that's often used, however you want to call it, but it's in the nomenclature. You're going to see that a lot. As we discussed earlier, there's always going to be, or not always, but often, yes.
Will we have a small break now?
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't realize it. Let me see if there, I think we have. No, okay, let's break now. Yeah. I thought we were almost on this. And then we'll do the planning first. I think just a few slides, and then we can do the planning of the relocation.
Okay.